Hello, and welcome to Badger Talks Live Quick Picks, which brings exciting happenings, resources, and talent from your UW flagship campus to the people of Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Markia Silverman Rodriguez from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I'm a master's student in the geography department, where I do work on environmental racism, and I'm also an advisee of our speaker today. I'm pleased to introduce Sarah A. Moore, Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Geography. Today, Sarah will explore how more than 1 million tons of hazardous waste are traded among Canada, Mexico, and the United States each year. In addition to managing a significant proportion of their own waste, all three North American countries are now net hazardous waste importers. Sarah will discuss data and analysis that address the major methodological issues hampering current explanation of this significant and potentially harmful trade. Dr. Sarah A. Moore is an associate professor of geography. She researches policies, practices, and economics of waste. She is co-author of Environment and Society, A Critical Introduction. Please welcome Sarah A. Moore.
Thanks, Markia, for that introduction, and to Badger Talks for having me here today. Before I begin, I want to highlight the work of my many colleagues and give a shout out to Chelsea Nussel and Heather Rosenfeld, who provided the graphic art you'll see throughout my talk. Waste pollutes, it oozes, rots, smells, it seeps into soil, into water, into skin. It contaminates, poisons, buries. Waste demands attention, management, containment, remediation, vigilance. In its specific forms, discarded plastics marked "Please recycle," containers of toxics plastered with skulls and crossbones, piles of garbage at the curb stamped "For collection." Waste asks for action and assures us that, if put in its proper place, it will leave us alone. In this project, we examine how hazardous waste specifically is managed both as a risk to local communities and as a traded good. What I discussed today is part of a larger project to document and explain where hazardous waste flows across North America, how these flows exacerbate environmental injustice and racism, and why documenting these flows is both challenging and urgent. So these are some of the numbers that Markia mentioned in the introduction, and they evince the significant regional trade in hazardous waste among North American countries. You've also heard this just recently, but it's surprising to some. So if we dig deeper, the answer to this question is that all three NAFTA countries are hazardous waste importers, including the United States. And that, in fact, the United States now imports more than twice as much waste in some streams from Canada and Mexico than it exports to the two countries combined. So you wouldn't be alone if you were surprised at those numbers. In fact, the two most popular economic trade theories, the pollution haven hypothesis and the comparative advantage theory, despite their differences, would anticipate that richer countries send hazardous waste to poorer ones. These theories in turn, drive our expectations of an international environmental justice, where we might be concerned that wealthier countries are dumping their waste on poorer countries, which in fact is not happening. This is an example of mercury waste being traded between the three countries. Therefore, we might also be surprised at these data in terms of international environmental justice. So why do these data look different than expected? What accounts for these surprises? One could argue that, in fact, the reason for these numbers is the effect of international trade agreements and regional regulations meant to stop those uneven flows from richer countries to poorer countries. That is likely a factor, despite the fact that US trade with Mexico and Canada is governed by bilateral agreements, since the US has not ratified international agreements. But there's also a question of what geography calls scale. We usually think about the nation state as the relevant scale, unit, or actor in international trade. But in fact, trade that happens across international boundaries is still very much trade from one locality to another. So you might indeed have this, but you also have this, which raises the possibility of subnational pollution havens, which are local places within those countries that concentrate waste with potential negative effects on public and environmental health. So rather than being an environmental justice success story, closer examination of our novel data set suggests another argument. National level analyses obscure what we found to be the ongoing proliferation of waste havens at the subnational scale in all countries involved, including the United States. So what does it take to get us from the national scale to understanding subnational flows? Well, first of all, it took several Freedom of Information Act requests. These, in fact, prompted the Inspector General of the US EPA to write to me because until I requested it, the data that would track subnational transfers of hazardous materials were kept in paper form. And what I was told by another staffer was a non-air conditioned room in a basement by the EPA. Eventually, a lot of time was spent by my research team compiling scanned PDFs, you see some of the numbers here, of shipping manifests, annual reports, and consent documents that are part of regulatory requirements for entities sending or receiving waste internationally. Should be noted that this is not what some of my colleagues would think about in terms of big data, and that includes Song Gao, who works with big data and is giving another talk in this series, but it is a sizable data set, and it has some issues. For example, we were sent scanned PDFs of the bottom page of a 3-level carbon copy form. So some things were difficult to read in the first place, but there are also notes on some of it, like need consent form, as on this manifest, or missing pages that were referred to but not there. So several uncertainties exist in this data that are caused by human error and inconsistent record keeping. I'm going to briefly talk about one case, which is battery waste. This is ambiguous hazardous waste coding, which is part of the problem. And I'll talk about how batteries illustrate some of the issues with that coding. So in the data, there are several ways to code batteries. Specific battery waste can be coded according to the UN as UN 3090 or UN 3091 in terms of lithium batteries. And so these are listed here. But there are also other categories that could include batteries. And those include things like batteries in vehicles or equipment, or batteries in storage, or that are particular other materials. So in addition to the codes, there's also a description in here, this part, which is waste lithium battery here. For many shipments, they don't match. So in this one they do, but in many they don't. So what that means is that there's you have to use all of these fields to capture more of the data. So we have a category that specifically refers to batteries, a category that refers to things that are coded as batteries but not described as such, and then other items that are being traded and managed through trade that are possibly batteries, but aren't identified specifically that way. So I've given you a few examples of some of the issues with the data, but I want to turn to some of the key findings, including patterns of distribution, corporate ties, and flows of waste. The larger map shown here states or shows that states, oh, sorry, this is still batteries. The larger map here shows that states vary dramatically in their relationship to the transnational hazardous waste trade, with Arkansas, Ohio, Michigan, Texas, and Nebraska importing the most shipments. In addition, there's a distinct regional concentration in the Midwest, especially in Ohio and Michigan, but also in the sites in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Notably, there's also considerable spatial variability within states. While Ohio, for example, has a large number of sites distributed throughout the state, importers in Illinois, Michigan, and Nebraska are concentrated in Chicagoland, Detroit, and Kimball, respectively. To evaluate potentially disproportionate effects of these distributions on poor communities and/or communities of color, in other words, possible issues of environmental injustice and environmental racism, we overlaid percent non-white population on the left here and percent of people living in poverty on the right at the census tract level. While shipments went to sites across the sociodemographic spectrum, many went to facilities in areas with very high percentage of non-white residents and individuals in poverty. A similar pattern is found when comparing shipments to poverty rates themselves. The Arkansas and Michigan facilities, for example, are located in areas with a high percent of residents in poverty, which is about 30 to 40% there, well above the national average of 14.9%. Waste imports are also unevenly distributed at the municipal scale. For example, in Detroit, 2 facilities are located in communities well above the national poverty rate. These are EQ Detroit, located in a community with a poverty rate of about 37%, and Dynacol Inc., which is located in a tract with about 35% poverty rate. These are also predominantly non-white areas, raising significant concerns about the role of hazardous waste importing in creating or perpetuating environmental racism. Both sites are also regularly out of compliance with regulations, with the EQ Detroit facility falling into this category 11 of 12 quarters during a couple of years or several years. Additionally, Dynacol and EQ Detroit are now owned by US Ecology, which is, by a number of import and export shipments, the largest entity in the North American hazardous waste trade. This means that the neighborhoods surrounding those facilities are increasingly linked to the decisions of a single corporation, choosing to move waste across an entire continent to local facilities in their neighborhoods. This network visualization demonstrates the corporate consolidation that's occurred in the hazardous waste trade, suggesting that there's an oligopoly. A few entities, especially US Ecology, Clean Harbors, and Veolia, are significantly larger and better connected than other firms. Clean Harbors, though, has fewer connection to other firms than the other two, indicating a significant amount of waste being traded between facilities within their own corporate network. To better understand the significance of this pattern, we conducted another network analysis on Clean Harbors itself. The company is valued at over $6 billion, and it accounts for over 20% of all US import and export shipments of hazardous waste to NAFTA countries. This shows how Clean Harbors moves waste across borders between facilities it owns in the US and Canada. If you're thinking of a site, the greater the height of the site, like Burton, Michigan here, the higher its share of all Clean Harbors trade. And Burton is next, near Flint, Michigan. Clean Harbors uses Burton, the Burton site, to take waste most likely generated elsewhere in the Great Lakes region in the United States and prepare it for shipment to Canada. Transfer stations like that would actually be obscured in traditional national scale analyses of transnational waste training. But any associated risk is a permanent feature of the site itself, emphasizing again the local consequences of corporate consolidation. For Clean Harbors, a company operating dozens of facilities across the US and Canada, the benefit of specialized management outweighs the transportation costs of moving hazardous waste long distances and across borders. In this map, which you saw earlier, of mercury waste shipments, you can see Clean Harbor's transnational reach means that communities in a place like El Dorado, which is one of the large dark blue dot there, are very much affected by this process. And this matters too, because like some of the facilities mentioned above, the El Dorado facility has also been in non-compliance with regulations in 75% of the quarters we studied. Over a 5-year span in our data, there were 21 enforcement actions against them, including over $1 million in penalties. So rather than understanding transnational environmental justice as preventing relatively rich countries from exporting waste to relatively poor ones, with these data, and in this project, we can ask how communities become bound to the global economy and to one another through waste trading. We can see how localities and communities in many countries come to be disproportionately affected by internationally traded hazardous waste. The maps and figures I've shown are not the whole picture, however. The elaborate and detailed process of regulating the transnational hazardous waste trade creates the expectation that waste can be rendered manageable through codes, its contents identified, contained, and when possible, made once again into something valuable. As a management and trade strategy, moving hazardous waste materials across a continent has consequences that aren't shown here. A fact that the people of East Palestine, Ohio learned firsthand in February of 2023. That day, a train, 11 of its cars carrying hazardous materials derailed, leading to a 5-day evacuation of residents. Last week, 24 cars of a freight train went off the tracks 10 miles south of the US-Canada border in northern Minnesota. Only a month earlier, another train had derailed in southwestern Minnesota. In the last decade, such incidents have increased dramatically. Witnesses to these incidents describe the squeal of brakes as accidents occur, the spread of ominous black clouds, and the acrid stench. This visceral experience of witnessing through sound, sight, and smell the transport of hazardous materials across the United States stands in stark contrast to the largely unnoticed 800,000 such shipments throughout the country each day. These daily shipments by truck and train combine to move over 3.1 billion tons of hazardous materials across this country each year. Railroads have pushed back against calls for more regulation, arguing that the production and transport of such materials are a normal part of business as usual, one whose risk can be responsibly managed, whose risk can be contained. But hazardous materials themselves, by definition, corrosive, explosive, flammable, or otherwise toxic, fundamentally resist containment. So despite new data on hazardous waste exceeds not only corporate will, but also well-intentioned regulation in any meaningful sense. While often in ways less dramatic than a train wreck, but no less worthy of our attention, hazardous waste then often escapes our attempts to contain it and demonstrates its volatile nature. If you would like to learn more about the work I've done on the hazardous waste trade, please see the site on the bottom of this page, and it's also in the chat. And if you have further questions, please feel free to post them in the chat and I'll answer them after the live stream. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you for watching this Badger Talks live event produced by the University of Wisconsin-Madison through UW Connect's outreach and the Office of State Relations. Follow us on Facebook and YouTube to see the library of past recorded talks. Please visit badgertalks.wisc.edu to see the schedule of upcoming talks, sign up for the Badger Talks email list, and search the roster of over 400 UW experts who are available to give talks on important issues in your Wisconsin community.